I'm author and critic David Agranoff. I'm a horror and science fiction author, critic, and researcher. In this podcast, I wanted to provide in-depth interviews and panel discussions with everyone from New York Times bestselling authors to researchers, musicians, and anyone I find interesting. Welcome to Postcards from a Dying World. Hello and welcome to another special episode of Postcards from a Dying World. I got this wrong last time. I believe this is the 11th Science Fiction Hall of Fame, but last time it was 10 and I said 11 the whole time. I could have the numbers wrong again, but we're here to talk about the second story by a woman in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, and sadly the last. We're here to talk about Only a Mother by Judith Merrill. And I have two special guests here to break it down with me as a part of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. And kind of building off my last two guests, who I also spent time with at Patrick's conference in LA. So with Brian Atterbury and Stephen Shapiro, who joined us for Murray Leinster's First Contact.
Oh, nice,
so,
nice.
Yeah. So we've got a very exciting story. This is one that I really was excited to do. Now, there's a obvious person that would have been one of my go-tos to talk about Judith Merrill, and I want to give a shout out to our friend Lisa Yazik, who she and I traded a few emails. She definitely wanted to be here. She's dealing with a personal crisis in her life. She lost her husband, and so shout out to Lisa, who is a big fan. Everybody has a ton of fans here at this podcast, has been on several times, and just my heart goes out to Lisa and to her son. And she has done many great lectures on this story, some of which I will discuss some of the things that she said. So I encourage you to go out there and find on YouTube. You can find her many of her talks, including ones on this story, and I'll put some in the show notes. But she co-edited a book with one of my guests. So Patrick B. Sharp is a professor at Cal State Los Angeles, and he was the co-editor of Sisters of Tomorrow. Patrick, tell the folks who you are and what you do.
I'm a professor of liberal studies, which is great because I don't have to be beholden to a English department's canon. I get to teach interdisciplinary classes and designed all the science fiction classes on our campus, which was fun. And I'm the founding executive director of Speculative Fiction Across Media, which is the conference where we first met, though I knew of you before that from the podcast. So yeah, that's a meeting we have, a conference we have every year in LA now, moving forward. I'm also the author of Darwinian Feminism and Early Science Fiction, Angels, Amazons, and Women, which came out with University of Wales Press in 2018, where I talk about the history of women's science fiction and their use of evolutionary discourse up to the 1940s. I wrote about Judith Merrill in my book Savage Perils in 2007, which was my first book. And I'm also newly anointed member of the board of director. No, what are we called? Editors, the editors at Science Fiction Studies. I'm a newly anointed editor at Science Fiction Studies. So yeah, it's a lot.
And that's awesome. And that's all good reasons to have you here. Speaking of that conference, the first person I saw speak or give a paper at that conference is also on this call, and that's Audrey Taylor, who gave an amazing talk on Anne McCaffrey, which was good for me as somebody who has not read enough McCaffrey. I did read McCaffrey when I was in middle school and enjoyed her work, but it was because of Audrey that I made a mental note that I am going to go back and read some McCaffrey. Audrey, you are a professor at Colorado State Pueblo, and where you teach genre fiction. We talked a little bit at the conference about your work teaching horror, which I think some people that listen to this podcast will be interested in. But tell the folks who you are and what you do.
Yeah, hi. I'm an assistant professor of English at CSU Pueblo. I am in the English department, but they're lovely and really happy to let me teach genre stuff like horror. As you mentioned, I was teaching a horror class last semester. So I get to do those along with other kind of more standard fare, which is great. I really enjoy that. So yeah, I was teaching horror last semester. American Horror Story was the kind of theme. So it's just American horror, basically. And let's see, my book was on Patricia A. McKillip, who is a fantasy author, so maybe not quite as interesting to some of the readers of this or listeners of this. But it came out in 2017, and it is called Patricia A. McKillip and the Art of Fantasy World Building. So if you're interested in world building, I also talk about that. And then, as you mentioned, I talk about Anne McCaffrey, and I'm forever working on a book on her.
Yes. And really enjoyed your paper at Speculative Fiction Through Media Conference. I'm saying it right, hopefully.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I've shouted out this conference a couple times. I really had a great time. We're looking forward to the second one. And highly recommend that people who like academic discussions and such, especially those of you on the West Coast, make it out to that conference because it's a real good time. Now, we are here to talk about, we're continuing to work our way on the podcast through the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. And this is the last story of the 1940s. And we've been in the 40s for a while. It's a pretty interesting time for science fiction. I think the decade that has the most stories in this collection might be the 40s. I haven't sat down and counted it, but we've had some really good stuff from the 40s, starting with, Heinlein and Clifford Smack and lots of really great stuff. But this story, and Judith Merrill is one that I have done a little bit of podcasting about before. So I do want to give a shout out to, I did a panel discussion about Judith Merrill on the Dickheads podcast, and Lisa Yazek was a part of that panel. And I actually don't remember everyone that was on the panel. There's 5 guests on that panel. So, but it's over 2 hours of Judith Merrill talk. More stuff than we will be able to get to today, because we're mostly focused on this one story. But we are going to get a little bit into the history of Judith Merrill. But starting off, starting with Patrick, what's your introduction to Judith Merrill, and how did you first discover her work? I know you said you've written about her before, but where did you first learn about Judith Merrill?
When I was in grad school, I was TAing for the science fiction class with Frank McConnell at UC Santa Barbara. And Frank McConnell taught this story. And that was the first time I'd read it. And this is when I was just starting to realize I could work on science fiction in a PhD program. There was a guy who teaches that. I could do that. So this was one of my first sort of, emerging from being a fan to actually, I could actually study this academically. And I remember this story being good, short, teachable, but also was right in the wheelhouse of what I was interested in, which was nuclear culture. I was interested in, the stories we told ourselves before the atomic bomb and after the atomic bomb, about the atomic bomb, right? Because H.G. Wells had come up with that in 1914, right? So thinking about those types of stories that this was such a different take from the typical, such a different take from the typical military fiction, or what I call the official science fictions of the generals, where they were talking about what, right after World War II, what World War III is going to look like and how we need to prepare for that war. And then in the middle of these, super, banging on the table, give us more money for the military kinds of discussions. Which is what I was reading through at that time. I came across this story. And I was like, okay, there's something here that I really need to I really need to explore. That's very different.
Now, Audrey, I didn't know I had no idea if you'd even ever heard of Judith Merrill. That wasn't, and so my thinking, of course, with this was that I knew you were a smart, analytical science fiction mind, and so I was like, well, one of the other people I invited who wasn't able to make it was Lisa Morton, who, for example, Lisa is one of the best short story writers I know, but she had not read Judith Merrill before. So my discussion with Lisa on this story was, offline was very good because, she was very excited to discover this story. I don't know. Had you read Only a Mother, or was this your first?
It was my like with Patrick, it was my first introduction to Judith Merrill. And like Patrick, it was also kind of early in my PhD. I was a little PhD baby, and I did the Science Fiction Foundation masterclass in London. And the person running that section, I think it was Carrie Sparing, had assigned a whole bunch of stuff, and this was one of the stories. Either Carrie Sparing or Mike Harrison, MJ Harrison, one of the two of them had assigned this. And um, it was such an interesting story, and I had a completely different take on it than everybody else in the room, which was interesting.
Ooh,
Uh,
we will
I
get to
was,
that.
yeah, I suspect it won't be as different from you guys, but it was for the people in that room. And so it was really interesting to read the story and to realize that I had my own opinion about things and about science fiction-y things because, like Patrick, I didn't know that you were allowed to study these kinds of things for a long time, even though I read them all the time. I don't know. I guess I thought it fell out of the sky or something. Yeah, so it was a really interesting story. I had a different take on it than the others in the room, and it led to some really interesting discussions and kind of learning how to hang on to what I thought was my own viewpoint. So it was kind of an important story in my genesis as an SF fantasy critic, I guess.
Right. And I will tell you all that I probably read it for the first time the most recently of all of us because I first read this story in Lisa Yazik's The Future is Female, admittedly. I knew Judith Merrill's name partially because I had a bunch of anthologies that she had edited, including like her anthology on Soviet fiction. And around the time that I read The Future is Female, I went ahead and read The Futurians, which is Damon Knight's history of um, uh, the whole science fiction community that sprung up around New York City that Judith Merrill came from. So a lot of the history that I have about Judith Merrill comes from The Futurians, from that book. I highly recommend. Um, it's not perfect. And Damon Knight's, historically one of the most famous curmudgeons, critically speaking of science fiction. And so sometimes his opinions, I'm like, oh, come on, dude, don't be so harsh with Damon Knight. But there's great history in there. And so well, let's get into that. Let's get into Judith Merrill. But for me, I read this story first in The Future is Female, and like I said, I knew her name, but I just, that's when I started taking Judith Merrill very, very seriously. And one of the things that, if you go and listen to my the panel discussion that we did on Judith Merrill, I like this story. I do think that Dead Center and Daughters of Earth are perhaps not as important of short stories, but might be my two favorites that I think are a little better short stories. That being said, that we cannot dismiss the importance of this story for many reasons that we will get into when we talk about the story itself. So a little history on Judith Merrill. Her grandfather was a rabbi, and he wrote play reviews or her father wrote play reviews for a Jewish newspaper. But a sad part of the story is that he committed suicide when she was 6 years old. So she mostly grew up with mom and the grandparents around. In 1939, Judith graduated from Morris High School in the Bronx. She graduated at 16, and she was already um, like a Trotskyist and already into radical politics at 16 years old. Now, it's interesting because I just read Jack London's The Iron Heel for the first time that had an intro from Trotsky. So which that's going hard, having a Trotsky introduction to your Jack London book. But I you know, Trotsky in 1939 was already in exile from the Soviet Union, but had already kind of started to become known as the guy who was opposing Stalin. And so, just to give people background on what it means to be a Trotskyist at the time. And I should apologize too. I just got over being sick, so I will hopefully not cough a lot. But in 1939, right out, right after she got out of school, in the next year, she married Dan Zisman, and they were, they met at a Trotskyist like hangout on the 4th of July, which is an interesting time for Trotskyists to all hang out at Central Park. But that's, they had a daughter, Merril Zisman, and obviously the name Merril and being the name of her daughter is, where her pen name came from eventually. In this period, she was also one of the few women that was hanging around with the Futurians and hanging out with this crowd. There was some overlap with the Trotskyists, as you can imagine. I think one of the people who was the two people that were the big crossover, I believe, were C.M. Kornbluth and Don Wollheim, who were more radical in those days than they would eventually. Well, Don Wollheim would kind of soften out the political edges, but in the 30s, he was a part of this whole thing. One of the things that came out of the Futurians was they started their own magazine, and I've got this copy of Stirring Science Stories from August 1941. So as early as 1941, they were doing this. The reason I have this particular issue, this was the first science fiction magazine one Philip K. Dick bought. So eventually, I'm not going to read this copy, but I'm probably going to read one. This copy, which apparently was bought at a magazine store in Springfield, Ohio, before it got to me. But that whole Futurians group spit out. This was a pretty serious magazine. They were doing fanzines in the late 30s, but by the 40s, they were already becoming professionals in the field. They were going to conventions. And one of the people that, after the Zismans when Judith and Dan Zisman separated, was a year later, she married Frederick Paul, who another Futurian, and of course they had children together as well. They weren't married for a super long time. But Judith Merrill's first publication was a 20-page fanzine dated January 1946. So the Futurians were already doing like actual magazines. One of the things about like these issues of these magazines is a lot of them were all members of the Futurians under like 13 different names publishing stories because they didn't have money to pay anyone. So, and one of the other clubs that they had was a club that they called the Hydra Club. And that was Judith Merrill, Martin Greenberg, Frederick Paul, Lester Del Rey, Harry Harrison, Jerome Bixby, Murray Leinster, and now I have on the list Avram Davidson was a part of that group, but I don't see how that was possible because he was in the Bay Area, but maybe he came to visit. But the first story that Judith Merrill sold was a detective story to Crack Detective. So her first actual like publication, which was very close to around the time that she did this story, only a mother. Now, to shoot ahead a little bit, and then we'll come back to this story. Her story, Dead Center, which was originally published by Tony Boucher and McComas in the November 1954 issue of Fantasy and Science Fiction, was the first or one of only 2 science fiction stories to make the Best American Short Stories volumes in the 50s. So that was quite a calling card for Judith Merrill. She began editing science fiction anthologies in the 50s. She started doing year's best anthologies that ran from 1956 to 67. Her last anthology she edited was in 1985. So she came back and did a few more year's best here and there. Anthony Boucher described her as a practically flawless anthologist, which is pretty high praise. And she had a role as books editor for a magazine of fantasy and science fiction. So she was editing the book reviews for a while. Now, some things you should know about Judith Merrill is in 1968, she signed on to an anti-Vietnam War advertisement in Galaxy. But she was the one who walked the walk and left the country over the Vietnam War and ended up moving to Toronto, Canada, where she lived the rest of her life and got old and eccentric in all the cool ways, including hosting Doctor Who as the Undoctor on Canadian television from 1978 to 1981, and of course, she did this thing too in the where she joined the Canadian peace movement, and she traveled to Ottawa dressed as a witch and hexed the Parliament, which is very, very cool. But one of the coolest things she did was towards the end of her life, she donated all of her books to the Toronto Library. And in Toronto now, there is the Spaced Out Library with the Judith Merrill collection. And one of the only requirements she made was that the collection have a bed so you can lay down and read. According to what I've read about it, I've never been there. Canada thinks resisting arrest and a protest is always a felony, so I'm not allowed in Canada. But I would love to go there someday. Anyway, so that is our history of Judith Merrill. Is there anything you guys want to say about Judith Merrill, the person, starting with Patrick?
Well,
go ahead.
Just what I know about her in that regard, beyond what you've already discussed, because I read the Futurians too and got a lot of information from there, was her anti-nuclear activism that really manifests itself in this story and in her novel Shadow on the Hearth, which came out a little bit over a year after this.
I'm dying to read that. I haven't.
Yeah,
it's hard to find.
It's really hard to find. I got a copy of it when I picked a copy up at a bookstore, and it's really one of those things you can see her starting to develop that mothers against the atomic bomb, mothers against nuclear weapons, peace movement that really starts to become a big part of her life towards the end of the 50s, right? As I understand it. So that's really the context in which I got to know her and know about her activism originally, was that through her peace activism that was a through line through her whole life.
Yeah, and it's cool and interesting to think about her being a Trotskyist as early as the 30s and already being involved in radical politics. And one of the neat things is she didn't iron out those edges very much as she got older, which is one of the things I like and respect about Judith Merrill as a person who didn't iron out my views either as I got older. But Audrey, how much of this history did you know? How much have you read about Judith Merrill before?
I haven't read that much about her. The only 2 little pieces that I know kind of second or maybe third hand, because she's not somebody that I've studied very much. I think she was actually the one that started the Hydra Club. So I think that not only was she in it, but she actually started it, if I'm correct. And the other thing is that her mother was also an activist. And so I think there's a pretty rich not just familial, but Jewish tradition of activism that she was coming out of. So it wasn't that she kind of sprang fully formed into activism, but it was kind of part of her upbringing, I imagine. And I think you can see some of that in That Only a Mother, because I imagine that living, in her mother being in the 20s and 30s and being this independent kind of person, it would have been very difficult. And so some of that feminism, I think, is coming through as well. And then
I'm
I know
sorry
people
about
who've
the crashing sound. It was a dog trying to push her way into the office. So
oh, I
it
didn't hear
knocked over
anything
my back.
actually. So
Um,
um
sorry to, yeah, but no, I think that's a really good point, is that activism. And also, like, I'm imagining that the tragedy that the family went through with the father committing suicide at 6 years old probably had something to do with, you know, that kind of uh, not giving a shit what people thought of them kind of thing, because they had to survive a tragedy when she was very young. So uh, I think that that informs a little bit about who she was, but also just the radical views. So okay, how about we get into the issue? Let me
Mhm.
share screen with you guys,
Oh yeah.
and this let's see. Um, there's the story as it appears um, in the issue. And of course, Campbell gives it this kind of shitty introduction where he says, a new feminine science fiction author gives a slightly different slant on one of the old themes, and brilliantly bitter little story results. Now, before we get into what Campbell said, well, I usually go through the issue to begin with, so I
Mhm.
gotta here.
Are you going to talk about the editorial at the beginning?
Yeah, we'll talk about the editorial. I shouldn't have started there. Let's look at the issue. So Dreadful Sanctuary by Eric Frank Russell was the kind of headlining story in this one. We'll come. I'm sorry. I should have read that intro, and it's terrible, and we'll talk about it. We'll get there because we also have to talk about how the. Oh, come on. Hold on one second, everyone. I gotta let uppers out. Sorry about that. So the Dreadful Sanctuary, the main novella, I kind of sort of read a little bit of it, and I read a lot of reviews of it, and it was the story that everyone was looking forward to in this issue, even though it's not the one that gets remembered. So the thing about this story is the first of a three-part serial. And one of the things that I know about this story is that everyone says this magazine version is superior to the one that was published as a novel, because they changed the ending, and apparently for the worse. So this June 1948 issue of Astounding is one that is where you want to, if you want to read Dreadful Sanctuary, I'm told that's where you got to do it. So we are in the post-war era for the first time. The last story that we read came out literally the month of D-Day, or I mean of the Nazi surrender. So this is the first time we've really gotten a look at an issue that's post-war. So the contents, the other big story in here is that there is an Asimov story in here. But this isn't a super great issue of Astounding. Some of the ones we've had have had like all kinds of classics and bangers, like just really high-powered stories. And this one doesn't. This Dreadful Sanctuary, which is one that I don't think is super well remembered, was the story that everyone was excited about. And even the Asimov story no connection. I know that's one of that's a pretty well-known story, but I don't remember what it's about. Do either of you know that story? No connection?
No.
No. No. Yeah. No connection to us. Um, yeah. And so one of the things that you also find in here is that there is an editorial here at the beginning. Campbell talking about uh, atomic power. Um, and I read it a couple weeks ago when I first started the thing. And it's an interesting editorial to be in the same issue as Only a Mother, but you know, because it's kind of like a pro, like we can do
Well,
good things with atomic power kind of
yeah, I
thing.
mean, he was, because he published that Heinlein story, Solution, I think a Solution Unsatisfactory, and a couple of others. And he had that editorial after the first, after the announcement of the atomic bomb. He really took ownership of, like, I predicted the atomic bomb. This is why science fiction is worthwhile. This is
Right.
why astounding is so great. And then he just went on and on about nuclear power for a
Right.
few years. And this is one of the ones I remember reading for my dissertation, where he's just talking about, like, this is getting into the atoms for peace kind of stuff, right?
Right.
That how we can use it for engines and for these, and there's like no mention at all of radioactivity, of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, no mention of any of the negatives.
Yeah,
Yeah.
which is interesting because didn't he publish Nerves as well?
Yeah.
The Lester Del Rey? Yeah.
Mhm.
Which yeah, so whatever. It's he's the editor, by the way
Yeah.
there. So and if you want to see the beginning of Dreadful Sanctuary, which has this um interesting art, in which shows that a deadly implausible idea just as deadly whether it is true or not. Just, I don't know what's going on there. I honestly, that the first sentence does talk about the moon rocket ushered in the year 1972. So there is some cool out of date stuff there, but uh, flip through the issue until we get to page 48, which is where Only a Mother is now. So the story behind um oh well, before we get into that, one thing I do want to go through the history. I know I usually do this. um June 1948 was this issue. So what was going on in the world in June 1948? Well, the Ed Sullivan Show premiered that this month, so TV was just starting. Stalin and Truman were giving dueling speeches. So this was really a month where the Cold War actually was ramping up. So that's a very interesting thing because Truman gave a speech in Berkeley where he basically like kind of threw down a Cold War gauntlet, and then Stalin gave a speech in Turkey. So um, but here's the Asimov one. Kipling's Fuzzy Wuzzy was no bear, but perhaps you had a better. I can't even.
Don't.
Yeah, it's not good. Let's move on. Yeah. So now we're at Only a Mother. Okay. So the story goes that Campbell and Judith Merrill were drunk at a party at a convention. They were both drinking, and Campbell was disparaging women writers in the field, which was interesting because we know there have been plenty of women that were publishing already before 1948. But Judith Merrill, in a drunken moment, said, I'm going to write a story and you're going to buy it. What do you know about this story, Patrick?
I know that, well, just to add to what you said, I know that he chewed out Leslie Stone and gave her that lecture in the late 1930s about how women couldn't and shouldn't write science fiction. But then he published so many stories by C.L. Moore and a couple by Lee Brackett, and so I think it wasn't that he liked to just talk shit about women in general. especially in relation to science fiction, but he had no problem publishing their stories to make himself money. I don't think he liked Stone because she wrote feminist kind of stuff, right? Whereas, Merrill, obviously a lefty, I'm still kind of shocked that this got published in his magazine.
Right.
But I mean, the way I think about this story, I'm like half historian of science, half literature guy, and I think about this again in the debates around nuclear weapons and the ways in which she's using genre here, especially primary genres, to tell the story using primary genres that are more familiar to women who've just experienced World War II, right? So she's using like letters, just like Mary Shelley in the epistolary novel, right? Like with Frankenstein has all those letters and all of that, right? She's using letters and telegrams and internal monologue and a lot of more feminine forms of writing and of communicating and using those as the foundation to weave a science fiction story. So that's one of the first things I always think about is how she's drawing on genres that were familiar to women, like writing letters to and getting letters from the man who's gone, off to war and, waking up and having that side of the bed empty and all that kind of stuff. So that's always my initial impression that I'm struck with when I read this.
Right. Um, did you know this alleged story, Audrey, that this was a drunken dare?
I had heard that, but in science fiction, so many of these stories get circulated, and then it's like, was that true or something they wanted to be true later? Or, I mean, so I had vaguely heard it. Um, but what I think is interesting, so Campbell had also published Anne McCaffrey. He published not her first story, but kind of her second and third, the ones that won the Nebula, etc. So he did, as Patrick says, and Anne McCaffrey always used her own name, as I made a point in
Mhm.
my paper. Like she didn't, it wasn't C.L. Moore, it was Anne.
Mhm.
Um, so, as you say, when he thought he could make money, he would do it. Uh, but I also think one of the things that Patrick said that was kind of interesting that made me think about, how she is using these forms that women are kind of familiar with in this time period. But I think one of the reasons that it might have gotten past Campbell, as it were, um, is that which he has such a patronizing little entry for the story. Oh, the little woman. And if you're reading it from that direction, and if you're Campbell and you really have those blinkers on, then the woman in the story is the perfect wife. She's all ready for him when he comes home. She's got lipstick on and her cute little dress, and she's done all the things women are supposed to do. And it's kind of, if you're reading it from that lens, then it's very much, oh, and she's just such an idiot. I mean, look at the baby and look how how she is living her life. She's just so stupid. And I think that is probably one of the reasons it got past Campbell, is that it can be read in this very like patronizing way.
She's neurotic and hysterical.
Well,
Yeah.
and it makes me wonder if Judith Merrill wasn't doing it on purpose to kind of like, like I'm gonna get this past Campbell by
Mhm.
doing this particular story, and I'm going to do it this way. This is one
Mhm.
of the reasons why I think the story is probably true, and I was going to get to this, is that I actually think, and Audrey brought it up perfect and teed me up perfect for this. But my theory is that a lot of these, I think Merrill was kind of poking at Campbell directly by having this particular setup with the woman, because it's like it's almost like she's putting bait in a trap to get Campbell. And I think it's one of the aspects of the story that's underrated, as
Mhm.
far as that's why that context of how Merrill came to this, and it makes it a different story, or one to consider what she was trying to say, because we know Merrill didn't have like a self-hating view of women, you
Mhm.
know, right? So I do want to point out, though, just in case, and I don't want listeners to think that, for one thing, just as a big CL Moore believer, um, Catherine Lucille Moore, everyone knew she was a woman.
Mhm.
The only
Mhm.
reason she went by CL Moore was to not lose her job at
At
Fletcher
at the
Trust
at the bank, yeah.
at the bank. Um,
Yeah.
and I specifically recently uh, read her letters with Lovecraft, and it's I also just learned, by the way, and I just think this is one of the coolest facts, is that she was staying after work to type up stories for other writers who were sending her handwritten stories, and C.L.
Mm.
Moore actually typed The Call of Cthulhu.
Wow.
And I did not know that until I started reading the letters. But one of the things that's exciting when we go back to these writers from this era, excuse me, a lot of like what we know comes from these letters and things. And we were lucky to have these correspondences. Um, to the Judith Merrill thing, we're going by the legend of the story, you know.
Mhm.
So do we believe it? Do we not believe it? I don't know. But I do think that the nature of how it was written um, and the style is very important. So we didn't really give an overview of the story. I'm assuming that people who come to these episodes have read these stories already.
We can give spoilers.
We can totally give spoilers. So, um, but overall, I'm assuming you reread it for doing this podcast.
Mhm.
What starting with Audrey, what's your take reading it now after having done so much research? You originally read it early in your research, but how does it hit differently now?
Um, I'm not, that's an interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that. I think probably I was paying attention to smaller details kind of in a critical sense than I maybe did the first time around. But the story and its kind of punch, I remembered the twist, but I didn't really remember how she got to it and the kind of ending as we're getting to it. And so, um, I don't think that like my how I feel about the story has changed. I think I probably read it slightly differently, but it's been a while, so um
Now
I
you
can't
said
remember.
now you said that the take you had felt differently from the people in the room in the class. So tell us that story. Like, tell us your experience of reading it for that class and how you felt like you were taking it differently. What did you mean by that?
Well, so it was a long time ago again. So anybody who was in that room and is like, wait, I didn't mean that. I'm sorry. I apologize to the internet at large. But I remember having this feeling of kind of like how Patrick was just talking about this story, this idea of and you that she was kind of getting something past people, and she
Mhm.
was writing in a way to consciously do that. And for me, the way that I took the story and the way that I took the mother is as a like a positive thing, as in if what she needs to do to be the best possible mother in this weird post world is to pretend that the baby's absolutely fine and just this little genius and isn't she wonderful, then great. I don't think I didn't feel like there was anything wrong with her and how she was taking the situation. I didn't feel like it was a bad thing to deal with what was probably not a great feeling when you initially have, this tiny, perfect little baby and it's supposed to be this way, and then it's another, it's a different way. One of the things that did come to me though, as I was rereading this was I think that even in the last kind of 15 years that the kind of looking at women's writing of science fiction has started shifting even in that short time. But also disability studies is a thing. And obviously it was still a thing when I was back in that master class, but it wasn't a thing that was in my brain at that time. And clearly there are angles of that within this story. So I think originally the most of the audience in the room with me was kind of critical of the mother for being blinkered to this or like or she is delusional, or, something like that. And I felt protective of her, almost like she was doing what she needed to do to be a good mother. And, that's what was being asked of her, and she's doing it. So I think that's where I kind of diverted.
Yeah, it's interesting because the disability aspect for the child is somebody who works with kids with disabilities. Like, um, one of the things that I've worked with kids with autism since like the late '90s, and one of the things when I work with very young people who are new to the field all the time is I'm constantly telling people to think about things from the parents' perspective. Like
Mhm.
I'm constantly telling all the young kids that work in the field, like, well, you you got to understand why the parents feel the way that they do about a lot of these things. And one of the things that's interesting about this story is that with Margaret in the story is that I feel like she's a good mother. She's doing, she's being protective of this child, but just the very idea that we have this character who's deciding to not like you know be horrified by this child who's affected by the nuclear situation is one thing, and then you get and I'm going to get to the ending here, I can't help it, but and then you have the father come in and have absolutely zero compassion. So that is also a statement that Judith Merrill's making, that she kind of got past Campbell is,
Mhm.
you know, um, I don't know if she was writing the story thinking, oh, well, I'll have him like, you know, want to destroy the child and Campbell will love it, you know, um, because was that what she was doing? I don't know. But this also, it just makes it and one of the things too about this story, and this is one of the reasons why I'm kind of sad that at least we couldn't get Lisa Morton here, is that I think Only a Mother is very much a horror story as much as it is a science fiction story. And that ending, well, has like a little Twilight Zone aspect to it. I think it's what makes it, you know, the story is unrelentingly depressing, and that ending just makes it 10 times worse. Now, Patrick, I'm interested in your perspective as somebody who studies this type of science fiction, where the cross section between the nuclear age and where this story fits in Cold War nuclear um, science fiction. Where does this story fit in the oeuvre of the overall genre?
I think I placed this, there's the version of it 20 years ago and the way I think about it now. Like the 20 years ago was, which I still believe is that I placed this and Philip Morrison's If the Bomb Gets Out of Hand from One World or None, which came out in March 1946, as two really crucially important voices of resistance that reached a relatively wide audience to the sort of the censorship, the glorification of the bomb, the glorification, the hiding of the negative effects. Both of them are talking about mutation and fallout and lingering radiation, something that the government was vehemently denying until the mid 50s, right? And so this is two scientifically informed people who are both saying, no, there's lingering radiation, mutation happens, though this is a science fictional version of that. Um, but I think about it as I also think about it now. I teach this story. I'm in a program that trains future elementary school teachers, and most of them have had, most of them are young women. Most of them have had a disability studies class, and most of them have had gender studies classes. And when they read this, they love this story because they see it the way Audrey was just talking about, right? Which is they see it as about a mother protecting a kid from medical discourse that is trying to create a sense of a norm that that it's eugenical, that discourse, and that father's hands tightening is the eugenical hands of the medical industry, and that last they always zero in on without any prompting in that last little bit that's from her husband's perspective, which is he's gripped with hysteria.
Yeah.
right? He's gripped with hysteria. And so that's the masculine hysteria is violent and
Mm.
destructive and destroying the world, literally destroying the world at this point, destroying the nuclear family, destroying the planet. Whereas the woman's hysteria is nurturing and protective. It's about making sure my child's okay, right? And so they see that as sort of a key moment where she's really kind of doing a poke to the reader. And I think it's fair to say Campbell, like, what does masculine hysteria look like? Oh, nuclear war. You know, that's the madness that's engulfing the world that she wants to fight against. And I think about it within the context of Shadow of the Hearth too, where she really develops a whole book around this, which is that one's more about there's a nuclear war and civil defense people come around and start trying to boss the housewife around and tell them what to do and keep on giving them bad advice. And the housewife has to sort of take charge and sort of rally the community and protect her family and what have you. And so I think I really do see it in these terms of like in this long history of women's science fiction that I've been studying. The domesticity as a woman's sphere becomes a source of strength and is like a building block for civilization, whereas masculine violence outside the home is what destroys civilization. So seeing women as the civilized ones, men as the savages. That's the whole Darwinian feminist thing that I wrote about, that you can see all the way back into the 1880s, with those feminist utopias, right? But going forward all the way through the early pulp era and into this, it's a pretty clear that men kill and destroy and do horrible things with progress. With women, when women use progress, when women are engaged in these stories, they're building communities, they're protecting their families, they're nurturing, they're the heroes.
Hmm.
It occurred to me one of the things that my brain sparked on when I was rereading it is it kind of reminded me of Raccoona Sheldon's The Screwfly Solution, where it's playing on that inherent, well, not inherent, but the masculine violence versus women trying to hang on to civilization.
Mhm.
And it kind of the ending kind of just it felt a little bit like that story as well.
Yeah, it kind of feels like right now too,
Yeah.
now that you say it that way.
Right. Right. Well, and it's interesting for me as somebody who's spent the last like couple weeks living in the brain of 1953 Philip K. Dick writing short stories, right? And not the most progressive dude in 1953, but he dealt with some of these issues. He dealt with some of the same like mutations and the Cold War, and certainly I read many pieces of his Cold War fiction from the early 50s. But what's interesting is when you put it in the context of this is the very, very, very beginning of the Cold War, right?
Yeah.
And when you put it in the context, the historical context, and knowing that literally the speeches that are igniting the Cold War were happening the month this came out. So this obviously was written before that.
Mhm.
It's really interesting to also put it in the context of Judith Merrill's like radical history already, like that we
Mhm.
know that she'd been a radical for a long time at this point, from before the Second World War, right? So she's probably she's obviously making a lot of statements about the world in general, right?
Well, can I make one more brief historical thing too? Is she's doing what John Hersey did with Hiroshima? That was really influential on a lot of nuclear activists, which, there was a lot of strategic discourse, from the perspective of the bombers and the generals. And that was the dominant discourse of the atomic bomb and nuclear war. And what Hersey did was he went into homes and looked at what happened to mothers whose husbands were off at war, to nurses, to everyday people in their houses as their houses were destroyed by the atomic bomb. And she's clearly, I mean, she's a very conscious writer. When I read her, I always feel like she knows exactly what she's doing. And it feels like she's doing that as well. She's drawing on that. We've got to look at what the impact of this is on everyday people in their homes, not like the generals talking about we gotta build bunkers and all this kind of crap that was going on in that period of time. Like literally the same in that same window, within a couple of months, there had been a one in, I think it was Newsweek and Life magazine, about the next war written by generals and what that's going to look like. And so she's really pushing back against that discourse.
And there's two things that come to mind for me, which is and as a Dickian, I obviously like his first real serious Cold War, World War III story is The Defenders, which is also his first one with robots that lie to people. And The Defenders is the one that became the penultimate truth, you know, where the robots were light and making everybody live underground, what's telling them that they were still fighting the war when the robots had stopped fighting the war a long time ago, right? And I think when you look at the Cold War context, it's very fascinating to see how science fiction is trying to grapple with, like, you know, the ideas of how this war could play out. You know, from 1948, looking at Only a Mother to I'm thinking like freaking Red Dawn, right? You know, like how the Cold War got played out in fiction is very fascinating because you know the war essentially stayed cold for the most part between those two powers until the Soviet Union fell. Now, one other story that you brought or you didn't bring up, but you made me think of when you're thinking about the way the homes are reacted to is also C.L. Moore's Vintage Season. Now I know Kuttner is given some credit, but most people believe most of Vintage Season is C.L. Moore. And this story is a time travel story, but also a nuclear war story, but was 2 years earlier than this. So, you know, there is some zeitgeist stuff going on there with, you know, with the women looking at a very ground level, house to house reaction to what nuclear war could do. Whereas the men are thinking of like, the bombs raining down and all that, you know, like it's just interesting to see that these two titans, these two women that were titans of science fiction of the era, you know, wrote these very on the ground level stories about it. So one of the things we have to do with the Science Fiction Hall of Fame stories is each time we have tried to come to a conclusion, like do we think this is this author's best work? Do we think it is their most important? Do we think it fits in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame? For example, with Campbell, you know, Twilight was the second story in here, but I have a hard time not thinking about Who Goes There as being a better story. Now, with Judith Merrill, there's other stories that I think I like a little better. Dead Center, Daughters of Earth. But I think because of the importance of what it says, I do think this is the correct Judith Merrill story to be in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame. What say you two, starting with Patrick?
I agree. I mean, okay, having put together anthologies and knowing how tight space is, if you want to capture Judith Merrill and her progressive sensibility at its best in a very short space, I think that this is the perfect choice. Historically, though, really, I think it's hard to beat this one too, just because, again, it was a voice in the wilderness at this point that was consistent for a long time. But it was one of the first anti-nuclear stories that really had an impact.
Audrey?
In science fiction. Yeah.
So I agree with Patrick and what he's just said, but I also feel like I kind of came at the question in a different angle, and the angle is, are we looking for that individual author's like best, whatever that means, anyway, because that's very individual, story, or are we looking for something that's impactful or shows the field or was really unique or whatever? And I feel like even this is a very impactful story, regardless of whether you feel like it's her best or her most interesting or her whatever it is. It's an impactful story. So I think it absolutely deserves to be there.
Well, and I would also add that the genius level kind of middle fingers at Campbell that you would never pick up on if you didn't know what we all know about Campbell in retrospect, because Judith Merrill would know all this stuff because she would have spent time around him or talk to everybody else who went to his office, and she would know all those things, right? And so the absolute hidden middle fingers that like got past Campbell, that he didn't pick up on, I think adds such a genius level to this story that is not everyone's going to pick up on that, right? And I certainly didn't pick up on it until the third time I read it, and really didn't until we started talking about it go, no, she absolutely did it on purpose. I feel like she absolutely did a lot of that to just be kind of a middle finger to, which, look, and Phil did the same. All of these writers in this era were playing with these editors a lot of times, knowing who they were writing for, knowing all these things. If you read PKD's The Turning Wheel, that is such a fu to L. Ron Hubbard, to Campbell, to all of it. I mean, like, it's 1952, but he's definitely and we know that the reason he wrote that story is his mom came home and told him, like, have you heard about this Scientology thing? I think it's really neat. And then Phil was like, no, I know too much. And then you get L. Ron the Bard, this religious figure in the story. But anyways, my point is that these writers did this, and I think Judith Merrill was doing that.
I think you can see clues to that in how schmaltzy she makes it in some ways. When you have the woman's dialogue to herself, take the nice newspaper's word for it.
Right.
I think that's what we in modern parlance would call trolling. Where she's thinking to herself, do women actually talk to ourselves in this way? No. Is Campbell's idea of how women talk to themselves? Absolutely.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
there's, very obvious levels of this kind of nonsense interwoven with the real, women, especially in this era, reading this story are going to have a very different experience of reading it than Campbell. They're going to be picking up on things like, obviously she's having morning sickness. She doesn't feel like eating breakfast, even though the doctor's telling her she has to. That is a very small detail that he probably, other things like the fact that the husband doesn't make it for her to actually deliver, which in, the late 40s was maybe not as common as it is now, but the father would still be visiting. And the fact that, oh, well, I don't feel very well, but it's okay. I'm still in hospital, but don't worry about it. The baby's fine, kind of thing. And all those things kind of feed into the story as Campbell would be reading it. And then there's that whole other layer that women reading it would be thinking about, like, yeah, that would be really hard to have just given birth and you're trying to write to the dad because he's not there.
Absolutely. There's there are so many levels to this story, and it's for such a short story. It has so much going on. I do think it's one of the best stories in this collection. So, which is saying something that I've read so far, because I haven't read. I am reading these a lot of these as I go, but most of them I've read before. Like the next one I have read already, but which I'll get to in a little bit. But and it's one of these things. It's just wonderful to, like, I think Campbell, people, there's one thing about Campbell that I wish we could impart to people a little bit more, is that there are sometimes this idea that Campbell didn't get pushback back in the day, and it's definitely not true. Campbell definitely got pushback. If you go back and listen to on my podcast and the Dickheads podcast, that we did 2 interviews with Barry Malzberg before he passed. And the first interview with Barry Malzberg, he tells the story about going to confront Campbell and to give him a piece of his mind in the 60s. And one thing that was really interesting about when Barry told that story was that he talked about how nervous he was to say all these things to Campbell and to tell him that he was a crypto fascist and all this stuff. And that Barry like laid into him, and but he said that there was a moment where Campbell like could tell that he was really nervous, and in the middle of Barry going off on him, he got very nervous, and he said Campbell reached up and put his hand on his shoulder and said, "It's okay, kid. I've heard it all before." And when he tells the story, what it said to me was Campbell was telling him like, "You're not the first person to come in here and give me a mouthful," you know. And so, there, I just want people to know that Campbell did. There was pushback to Campbell when he was alive. I know some people think there wasn't, that he was treated with, more respect than he deserved. But I think that I think this Judith Merrill story is more evidence that these things happen. On that note, I've taken up a lot of your time this evening, and so I do want to push us on. Is there any other Judith Merrill works that you want to point people to? I specifically, the Best of Judith Merrill collection has Only a Mother, Dead Center, and Daughters of Earth, which I think are all great stories. Her work as an anthologist is, of course, very important. Anything else anybody else wanted to say about her?
Yeah, Daughters of Earth and Shadow on the Hearth, which is not reprinted a lot, but if you can get your hands on it, that's worth a read.
Yeah, it's on my list. I definitely am working on trying to get it because it sounds great. Audrey, anything?
I don't have anything to add. I'm taking notes about things that I want to go and look up myself.
Well, that's what we do around here.
Yeah, it's great.
Excuse me, folks. So on that note, the next episode of the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series, I haven't figured out who the guests are going to be, but it will be Cordwainer Smith's Scanners in Vain, Live in Vain, Scanners. I got to remember the Skinners Live in Vain. I have read the story. Cordwainer Smith is a very interesting character, so it should be a interesting episode. I think for a couple months ago, I got a commitment from Brian Evanson to do that episode, but he didn't know he was going to be living in Germany when we first talked about doing that episode. So I do suspect it'll be Brian Evanson and somebody else, but Brian was very excited to talk about Cordwainer Smith. So as you all will find out in the next episode, Cordwainer Smith is a very interesting person. But that's the next story up in the Science Fiction Hall of Fame series. The next episode of this podcast should be Ray Naylor talking about his upcoming novel, Where the Axe is Buried. His follow-up novel to Mountain in the Sea, which I got to read already, and it is fantastic. And very timely look at oligarchy and power. So another fantastic political science fiction novel by Ray Naylor. So that comes out in April, so pre-order, please. But the discussion on the podcast will be spoiler-free. For the most part, just talking about themes and those kinds of things. This is Ray's third time on the podcast, so highly recommend checking out The Mountain in the Sea, his first novel, which I think was my top read of the year before. So Ray Naylor's the next thing coming up. Patrick, what have you got going on in the world? Do you want to promote to people?
I just read science fiction studies. That's where I'm working on right now. Subscribe to the journal. And if you have good scholarship, submit it to the journal.
I need to work on my paper for your conference for next year. That's one of the themes are so PKD. I have 18 ideas. I just have to decide on the one that I want to
Thank you for queuing me up on that. Yeah, the speculative fiction across medias next year is going to be in late September. It's going to be again here in Monterey Park, which is the fun side of LA. And it's going to be, the theme is going to be focused on AI and artificial intelligence. We're going to have Galen Hurd, we're going to have Ted Chiang, and it's going to be a great event.
All right. On that note, I'm very excited about that. Audrey, what have you got going on?
Aside from teaching.
Aside from teaching.
Yeah. Yes, I will eventually have an article out on N.K. Jemisin and world building, but I don't know where or when yet. It's kind of in process. And then eventually, one century, I will have a book out on Anne McCaffrey. What century? I don't know yet. But eventually, so, if you watch this podcast 5 years from now, maybe there will in fact be a book by me on Anne McCaffrey.
And I will definitely have you on to talk about it.
Awesome.
I really enjoyed your paper on Anne McCaffrey, and it was like sexuality in Anne McCaffrey's work, I believe was the paper. It was very good. So
Cool. Glad you liked it.
it was the first paper I took in at the conference last year, so it was a great start. On that note, everyone, please, of course, like and subscribe to the podcast. We also have some big doings going on over at Dickhead, so keep your eye out for that. One Tim Powers is coming on soon, and that is going to be a phenomenal episode. And if you haven't got a chance, I want to put a shout out to our Dickheads episode with Linda Castellini, who was with Tim Powers picking Phil up at the airport when he moved to Orange County. And she has all kinds of interesting stories because she was an English student at Cal State Fullerton when Phil was hanging around. And so she has lots of great stories about meeting Harlan Ellison, going out on a date with Norman Spinrad, all kinds of fun stuff. It's up there on the Dickheads podcast. So that is our most recent episode, and I really hope people will check that out too. So on that note, folks, we will be back with Cordwainer Smith. And I definitely enjoyed this discussion. Please read more Judith Merrill. We need to get the word out on that. So thanks for joining us tonight, and we'll see you next time.